Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight for a look at film adaptations of horror books. We're going to explore some of the most successful and least successful film and play adaptations of horror books with movie buff Frank Mandosa, who will share his popular presentation entitled Sleeping with the Lights On, Page Turners to Keep You Up at Night, filled with photos, video clips, and trivia. Frank is a full-time high school film and English teacher. He's been giving film lectures at libraries, senior centers, and community centers across the state since 2012. He's the host of the movie-themed podcast Screensavers and the co-host of Real Life, an award-winning local access TV show that features movie reviews. So everyone present on Zoom and those that will watch later on demand, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Frank for joining us here tonight. And Frank, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. And thank you all for coming in tonight. I really hope you enjoy it. I will be honest with you and tell you that for me, Halloween is my absolute favorite holiday of the year, and horror movies I've always had a soft spot for. Not necessarily the really trashy ones, but some of the more sophisticated ones I can really go for. So being able to give this presentation at this time of year is a real treat for me because it is one of my favorites. I also want to thank you. I just want to thank you, Robert, as well as the Tewksbury Public Library, the Friends of the Tewksbury Library, as well as the Pollard Memorial Library in Lowell for making tonight's presentation possible. And of course, again, thank you to all of you for tuning in. I have here on the screen a GIF file of the famous vampire Nosferatu from the 1922 silent film classic of the same name, Nosferatu. Now, we'll be talking a little bit about the background of how this movie came to be. This is one of a handful of films that we'll be talking about tonight. But before we dive into specifics about the films, I just have something to offer. Actually, well, first this little bit of self-promotion. As Robert mentioned, I do have a podcast, a film podcast called Silver Screeners. You can find it on most major podcast platforms, so please feel free to go in, give it a listen. And you can also, if you'd like to, follow me on social media. I have a public Facebook film group called Silver Screeners, same name as the podcast. You can also follow me on Twitter at FilmBuff1974, Instagram Frank Mandosa 1974, or you can email me the good old-fashioned way at silverscreenerspod@gmail.com. So if you have any questions, any comments that you don't have the chance to ask or to offer by the time tonight's presentation ends, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm always thrilled to hear from fellow movie lovers, silverscreenerspod@gmail.com. But I said I had something that I wanted to show you before we dive into talking about any specific films. So I have a question for you. Has this ever happened to you? Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. But when I came across this online, I said, too good to pass up. I need to include this one. So. At any rate, I'd like to begin by offering you a personal anecdote. I'm putting myself on the line here. A little piece of childhood trauma that lingers with me to this day in terms of the first thing that really scared me. Now, maybe you're familiar with this famous painting, the Mona Lisa. My grandparents, when I was a little kid, they lived in Roslindale. So every other week, my family and I, we would go and we would visit them on Saturday nights. I was probably, going up until I was probably about maybe 7 or 8. Well, they lived in Roslindale in a 2-story home across the street from the railroad tracks. So anytime a train would go by, I would jump a mile. And there was only one bathroom in this house, and it was on the 2nd floor, which meant that anytime anybody would need to use it, they would have to go upstairs all by themselves. Now try doing that at the age of 4 or 5 years old with the sound of the commuter train rushing across the street, rushing down the tracks. And every time you walked down the hall, you saw this. They had this Mona Lisa. It was a maybe like a 10 by 12. It was a cheap imitation of a Mona Lisa in a plastic frame, and it was not hanging up in the walls in the hallway. Where it was hanging up was in a little alcove. So you walk down the hall and it wasn't even a room, it was a little alcove. It didn't even have a door. It had a door frame with a shower rod that they had put up, and they had curtains hanging from the shower rod. And all you had to do was walk past this alcove, turn to your left, take a look inside, and this was hanging on the wall of the alcove facing the hallway. So you can only imagine. I would get very, it would be a little panic inducing. So finally, I fessed up to my fear, and my grandparents said, "Oh, no problem. We'll just take it off the wall before you come." And it worked for about 3 seconds until that time that they forgot to take it down. So I just want to apologize to all of you. If any of you were around 1979, and if your ears are still ringing from this blood-curdling scream that probably went global, that would have been me about this Mona Lisa painting. And the joke of it all is, the punchline, the PS, is that once my grandparents passed away, guess who got this painting? So I have a little show and tell for you here. This is it. This is the very thing, the very same, the same frame, the same everything. So I keep it face down inside a plastic bag, inside a shoebox underneath my bed, where it's out of sight and out of mind. But I mention this because I wanted to share with you one of my personal childhood fears, this painting right here, this image. Some see a great work of art. I see Linda Blair from The Exorcist. So a little bit of photoshopping magic there, but that's what I see. She's just not either on the left or on the right, just not a very comforting, at least not for me, a very comforting vision. Anyway, what I would like to do is to offer you the breakdown of what tonight's presentation, Sleeping with the Lights On, Page Turners to Keep You Up at Night, what you can expect from this presentation. We're going to begin with just a couple of trivia questions to get the ball rolling. I'm going to invite you all to type your guesses into the chat. They're all multiple choice questions. Just type the letter, keeping it simple. We'll begin with a couple of trivia questions. We'll go into a brief background of the horror genre in general. Then we'll be taking a look at a small sampling of specific writers and some of their works. Some of, as Robert said, some of the most successful, and perhaps some that sort of fell by the wayside. And then we'll take a look at the film adaptations as well. And there'll be a couple of clips and a couple of trailers that I'll be showing you throughout the presentation as well. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Here is the first trivia question. And again, I invite you to go into the chat, type in whatever letter is your guess. Each of these actors played Dracula on film. Each of them did. But who originated the role of Dracula on the US stage? We're talking the Broadway play, which debuted in the 1920s. To be specific, 1927. And I'm seeing a couple of C's. I'm seeing a B. Okay. So Bela Lugosi, Lon Chaney Jr. And I will give you the correct answer on the count of 3. 1, 2, and 3. It was Bela Lugosi. It was Bela Lugosi who originated the role on the New York stage. And I'll give you some more background about how that all played out in just a little bit. The next question I have for you. Stephen King is probably one of the most well-known authors of his time, let alone one of the most well-known horror authors of his time. A lot of his movies have been, a lot of his books have been adapted to film. Which film adaptation did he absolutely despise? Guesses are running the gamut here. I'm seeing A, I'm seeing B, I'm seeing C. And again, I'll count backwards from 3 this time. 3, 2, 1. And the correct answer is The Shining. The Shining. He absolutely, he did not like a thing about this movie. He did not like the casting. He did not like the way that Kubrick used the camera. He picked it apart. And again, I'll tell you more detail about that as we get to The Shining. Now, the Academy Awards. This year's Academy Award nominations are going to be announced on Tuesday morning, Tuesday of next week. And usually, not always, but usually, the Academy tends to overlook horror movies, performances in horror movies, call it a sense of elitism, call it a sense of snobbery, whatever it may be. Horror just does not tend to go well with the Academy, but there are sometimes some exceptions, some notable exceptions. So the next question here is this. Each of these performances earned Oscar nominations. Of them, who actually won? Did Kathy Bates win for Misery? Did Audrey Hepburn win for Wait Until Dark? Did Ellen Burstyn win for The Exorcist? Or did Linda Blair win for The Exorcist? They were all nominated. And I'm seeing a couple of A's, guesses for Kathy Bates, and you are indeed correct. Kathy Bates received the Academy Award for Best Leading Actress, Best Actress in a Leading Role for 1990's Misery. Something that was unheard of. At the time, something that was unheard of. Again, there were the occasional nominations, as you can see here, but as far as actually receiving the Oscar, this was breaking new ground. So just a couple of images just to give you a little glimpse as to the acting genius that Kathy Bates is. She is a series regular on American Horror Story, so she has not left the horror genre. She also actually returned to another Stephen King film adaptation, Dolores Claiborne. He wrote the book Dolores Claiborne maybe about a year or two after the film Misery came out. He wrote the book with her in mind. And when they made the film adaptation in 1995, she took the leading role. He was that impressed with her performance. Each of these movies were all Best Picture Oscar nominees when the years that they initially came out. Which of these actually received the win for Best Picture? Was it Jaws, Silence of the Lambs, The Exorcist, or The Sixth Sense? All Best Picture nominees, but which one actually got the award? And I'm seeing D, I'm seeing B, Sixth Sense, Silence of the Lambs. Well, I can tell you this. The Best Picture winner of 1991 was Silence of the Lambs. Silence of the Lambs. In fact, not only did Silence of the Lambs make history as one of the few horror movies to receive the Oscar for Best Picture, not only that, but it also is now in the record books. It's in a three-way tie. A movie that swept the top 5 Oscar categories: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Leading Actor, Leading Actress, and Best Screenplay. Silence of the Lambs is the third and, to date, the most recent film to sweep those top 5 categories. The other two were It Happened One Night with Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert, and the third, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson and Louise Fletcher. So a little bit of Oscar trivia for you there to help to get you pumped for Tuesday morning. Okay, which Audrey Hepburn Fright Fest was first a very tense stage thriller by the same guy who wrote the play Dial M for Murder, which Hitchcock adapted into a film. And I got a little cutesy with the titles here. Roman Holiday and Breakfast Without Tiffany, My Fair Lady, which for some people is a horror movie in and of itself to sit through, and Wait Until Dark. And Wait Until Dark it is, yes. Wait Until Dark. Audrey Hepburn plays a woman who has recently been blinded in an accident, and she has to defend herself against the sociopathic Alan Arkin in her basement apartment in Greenwich Village at nighttime. So it's a great story and an even better film. If you haven't had a chance to watch it yet, I highly recommend it. Okay, so that's the trivia portion of tonight's presentation. What I would like to do now is just a very brief overview of how the horror genre, the history of it, how it came to grow in popularity, ultimately paving the way once movies came around for there to be a niche in the movie industry. As far as one of the earliest recorded horror stories, I don't know if you can actually call it horror. It's Greek tragedy, but it's pretty horrific. It's called Oedipus Rex, and it dates all the way back to 429 BC. The premise of Oedipus Rex is that a husband and wife, they have a baby boy, and it is foretold that this baby boy would cause, let's just say, great distress. I won't give anything away. So, wanting to prevent this from happening, they decide to abandon him on the side of a mountain. And that's exactly what they do. And he does not die. In fact, he is taken and I think he's raised by wolves, if I'm not mistaken. And eventually, he and his parents cross paths again later on in life, even though he does not know they are his parents, and they do not know that he is their son. I will say nothing further than that. All I will say is that it is probably one of the most bleak and one of the most cynical and pessimistic messages about what life is all about, ever committed to pen and paper. He says, "We must call no man happy until he has passed the border of life and death without suffering pain." Pretty cynical perspective, don't you think? So that is the Greek tragedy Oedipus Rex. Now, as far as what's going on in this image right here, it's pretty horrific. This is at a dramatic turning point in the story, and he inflicts harm upon himself out of a sense of hatred. Fast forward now about maybe 2,200 years later to, I tell you, this is an overview. This is an overview. 1765, horror literature really began to take off in Europe in the 17 and 1800s. Horace Walpole wrote what is considered the first Gothic novel in the English language, called The Castle of Otranto. It was published in 1765. It was adapted into a film in 1977, a short film that's only about 17 minutes long. Because of its length, I can't show it to you tonight. But if you look it up on YouTube, it is there. You'll find it. It's interesting. The premise is that you have a 1977 modern day reporter who is interviewing someone involved in the story, the Castle of Otranto. As far as what the Castle of Otranto is about, again, like Oedipus Rex, it's the story of a really twisted family dynamic with elements of tragedy and supernatural horror interwoven throughout as well. The main character, Manfred, he is the Prince of Otranto, which is in southern Italy, and he wants an heir. He does have a son named Conrad, but his son is sickly. And so what he decides to do, well, I need to have my son get married and produce a son of his own, because I cannot trust that Conrad will be around forever. I'm probably going to outlive him. I need an heir to the throne. So if I can't have a son, I will have a grandson. So he pushes Conrad into marriage, into marrying Princess Isabella. Let's just say that the story involves a curse. It is not a plot spoiler to say, because it is the catalyst for most of the plot. Conrad actually dies on the wedding day, which also happens to be his birthday, by a helmet falling on him. This is all going in line with the curse. Manfred, instead of mourning the loss of his only son on his son's wedding day and birthday, Manfred says, I need an heir. I'm just going to marry Princess Isabella myself. I will leave it at that, but I will say that there are elements of the supernatural in the Castle of Otranto. As you can see from this image alone, huge hands and feet. You have the quote unquote damsel in distress running around, through underground vaults and tunnels underneath the castle. It's cliches by today's standards, but for 1765 readers, it was definitely a thrill ride. We cannot talk famous European Gothic novels without mentioning Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, she was 19 years old when it was published. As far as the background, how this story came about, she had a lover, a married lover, whose name was Percy Bysshe Shelley. They would eventually marry, but when she and Percy Bysshe Shelley, they decided that they were going to take a trip together. They had an infant together, a baby, Also traveling with them was Lord Byron, the Lord Byron. These three friends went on a trip together to Switzerland, specifically to Lake Geneva. Unfortunately, and this is all the true story that I'm telling you here. Unfortunately, what was going on at the time was there was an eruption of Mount Tambora on an Indonesian island, and this just splattered all the way out into the atmosphere, all of this ash and sulfur and pumice, and it caused a unusually cold, wet, rainy summer globally. In fact, it's been called the year without a summer. So whatever plans they had for their trip to Lake Geneva, water skiing, sunbathing, whatever it was they had planning to do, wasn't going to happen. So they spent night after night in the lodge where they were staying by a fire, just doing their best to try to make the most of it. Until finally they said to each other, okay, well, you know what? Let's do this. We're all writers. Let's each of us write a ghost story tonight when we go up to bed. And when we come back down here tomorrow night again, we'll tell each other our ghost stories. Well, that night she went to bed. And what happened was she had a nightmare. And in her nightmare, she's lying in bed. And the bed curtains are all closed around her. And suddenly in her nightmare, through the bed curtains comes this hand that reaches out for her. She wakes up in a cold sweat. I would imagine that a lot of us would be freaked out by such a nightmare. And that was where the idea for Frankenstein was born. Because if you read the book Frankenstein, you will see that the moment the creature comes to life, Dr. Frankenstein, like a coward, runs away from it, hides in his bed, pulls the cover up, pulls the bed curtains shut, and the creature, non-threateningly, but just clumsily and oafishly, stumbles his way after him, and indeed reaches through the bed curtains, reaching out for his father. Now, I'm not sitting here telling you that she wrote all of Frankenstein in that one night. The story, of course, evolved over a year or so. This was the night where she was first, no pun intended, lightning struck, and the first germ of an idea came about. Now, in the book, the character of Dr. Frankenstein, whose name is Victor, Dr. Victor Frankenstein, he seeks knowledge that humanity just should not have. He wants to conquer death. He wants to control nature. He basically wants to be God. He creates this creature. Just as in the famous Boris Karloff film, the creature is made up of various body parts all sewn together, organs and a brain and that kind of thing. In the book, however, it's extremely different from the Karloff film. In the book, the creature has, first of all, the creature has no ill intent at all at first. The creature is just ignorant and unaware and just craves acceptance and love and companionship. And from the very first moment that the creature opens his eyes in life, the very first image he sees is Dr. Frankenstein looking down at him and suddenly recoiling in horror and disgust at what he has just created. Yellow eyes, jaundiced skin, as you can see here on the right-hand side, scars all over his face, all over his whole body. This is not the way Dr. Frankenstein was expecting it to look. He was not expecting it to turn out this way. He thought he was creating a perfect physical specimen. So the poor creature is rejected from its first moments alive. He tries repeatedly throughout the book to make friends, to find love, to find a sense of camaraderie with somebody, anybody. And everyone just keeps recoiling in horror at the sight of him until finally his rage takes over. So you hardly have here the story of, a horror movie villain per se who was born to do evil. This is not Michael Myers. This is not Freddy Krueger. This is a creature who, when all is said and done, just wants acceptance. And I'm telling you all of this because, interestingly enough, in 1994, when the story of Frankenstein was adapted for film again, directed by Kenneth Branagh, starring Robert De Niro as the creature. Robert De Niro insisted during the production of this film that nobody refer to his character as a monster. He did not see the character as a monster. He insisted that cast and crew use the word creature whenever referring to him. As far as Boris Karloff's approach is concerned, of course, with Boris Karloff and with the legendary makeup that he was given, you have the square head, you have the two electrodes in the side of his neck, you know, you have the walk like this. None of that is in the book. None of that is in the book, but Boris Karloff did make the role his own. Now, Boris Karloff, in The Bride of Frankenstein, the second film in the series, he did three Frankenstein films: Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Son of Frankenstein. With Bride of Frankenstein, the second of the three, it was in the script for the creature to talk. He felt that this was not the right direction to take the creature in. He felt it would remove the mystery. And what's interesting is that in the book, the creature is self-educated, reads books on philosophy and religion, and becomes quite articulate, in fact. He and Dr. Frankenstein in the book, they meet up and they have this long, intricate conversation, very eloquent, very articulate. The creature is no dummy. So it's interesting that Boris Karloff's feeling was the creature should never speak. As far as a little bit of background on Karloff himself, James Whale directed the first two Frankenstein films, and when he was casting about for the perfect actor for the creature, he saw Boris Karloff at the studio commissary having lunch. And he apparently approached him and said to him, "Your face, Mr. Karloff, has interesting possibilities." Rather cryptic message, to be sure. I don't know if I would take that as a compliment, but it led to Hollywood history. At the time he did Frankenstein, Boris Karloff had already done 80 films. I'm not saying he was the lead in all 80. You know, he did bit parts and things like that. He had done 80 films. And apparently, during the production of Frankenstein, he was so convincing as the creature, so the story goes, I mean, we can take it with a grain of salt, but so the story goes, one of the studio secretaries saw him done up in his makeup during lunch, heading his way to the commissary for lunch, and she fainted. So Carl Laemmle, the producer of the film, he insisted that from then on, Karloff wear a blue veil to cover his face anytime he would walk on or off the stage, so as not to scare anybody. How much validity is there to that story? I wasn't there. I cannot confirm or deny. All I can say is that that's a story that that's been passed down through the generations. I mentioned already that Karloff did 3 Frankenstein films. How's this for a for a little love photo? The costume was 48 pounds, and he's wearing green face makeup all over his body as well, his arms, his hands. Now, the film was shot in August in California, wearing a 48-pound costume. By the time the production was done, by the time the shooting was done, he had lost 20 pounds. And despite all of that, when it came time for the film to premiere, he was not invited to the premiere. The studio, in a marketing ploy, decided if people know ahead of time who the actor is playing the creature, nobody will be scared. So what do we have to do? We have to keep his identity a secret. So he was not invited to the premiere. Not only that, but if you watch Frankenstein, go and watch Frankenstein, in the opening credits, his name is not listed. You have Dr. Frankenstein, Colin Clive. You have the actors and the roles they play. You have the creature, and then instead of Karloff's name, you have a question mark. It's during the end credits when his name finally appears. It was a publicity stunt, and it worked. I do have a little anecdote to share with you here about this famous scene. This is a little girl by the name of Marilyn Harris. She plays Maria in the film, and in this scene, he picks her up and he throws her into the water. And when they filmed the scene, she did not sink the way she was supposed to. James Whale felt bad that he would have to ask her to do the scene again. So he took her aside and he said to her, "If you agree to do this again, I will give you anything that you want. And so she thought about it. And she said, okay, I know what I want. And he said, okay, what is it? She said, I want a dozen hard-boiled eggs. A dozen hard-boiled eggs. She apparently, unfortunately, had the stereotypical stage parent who was constantly on this poor little girl about her weight. If you want a career in the movies, keep your weight down, keep your weight down. You're not allowed to eat this, you're not allowed to eat that. Similar to what Judy Garland experienced. So she was never allowed to have eggs. So she said to James Whale, I want a dozen hard-boiled eggs. She filmed the scene again. This time it worked. He gave her 2 dozen hard-boiled eggs out of gratitude. Now, whether or not her mother ever found out, that I don't know, but I can tell you that he gave her 2 dozen eggs, and it was for her. It was a personal triumph. I do have here, for your enjoyment, one of the re-released trailers for Frankenstein, and then after this trailer, we will move on to the next film.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
When this dead hand moves, the monster created by a man they called mad is turned loose to strike terror into the hearts of men. To shock women into uncontrolled hysteria.
Elizabeth!
To prey upon the innocence of children. This is the story you've heard about, talked about. The spine-tingling, blood-chilling story that stuns your emotions. Frankenstein.
Don't touch that!
So that was the re-release trailer for the original Frankenstein. Moving into our next story. Maybe you're familiar with the name Nathaniel Hawthorne. Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of classics such as The Scarlet Letter, Young Goodman Brown. He also wrote House of the Seven Gables. Now, this is a this is an actual building, an actual house that is up in Salem, Massachusetts, and it's, by the way, Salem is a fantastic day trip. Say Tewksbury's closer there than I am, but definitely worth the time. As far as Nathaniel Hawthorne goes, just a couple of interesting facts about him. Nathaniel Hawthorne's great-grandfather, or maybe it was great-great, it was either great or great-great, an ancestor of his was one of the judges during the Salem witch trials. He was not impressed by this. He felt that the witch trials were a horrific disgrace. He felt that they were just the worst of humanity, people getting so caught up in hysteria that they condemned innocents to death. He was not proud of the fact that he had this link to the witch trials. In fact, he was so unhappy with this association, he changed his last name. He inserted the W into his last name. If you look it up, the great-grandfather's last name was Hathorne, H-A-T-H. What Nathaniel did was insert the W. So The House of Seven Gables is one of his most famous books, and it was adapted. It was adapted into a film with none other than the great, the one, the only, the icon, Vincent Price. I won't get in too much with the story. Let's just say that there is this house that is built. There is a curse on it, and I'm speaking of the book first. There is a curse in this house. Basically, the premise of the story is that you have a colonel by the name of Pinchin who falsely accuses a carpenter of witchcraft. The carpenter's name is Matthew Mall. Matthew Mall is hanged. Now, Colonel Pinchin usurps his land as well as the home on it. And Matthew Mall's, curse, he puts this curse on anybody who would even dare to live in this house. Several generations later, we have two brothers, Clifford and Jaffrey. Now in the film, Clifford is played by Vincent Price. All I'll tell you is this. Jaffrey is the bad guy. He's the baddie. He is the baddie in the story. He doesn't care if he has to throw Clifford under the bus. He wants the home. He wants the family fortune. Vincent Price, believe it or not, is the innocent good guy who is a victim of circumstance. Supernatural elements in the book that are much stronger than the film. The film really downplays the supernatural elements of it all, but the film is still worth a look. So I have here a clip from the film where Vincent Price, well, Clifford is falsely accused by his greedy brother Jaffrey.
This court has found you guilty of patricide, and it therefore becomes my duty to pronounce sentence upon you. Because of the failure of the state to offer proof beyond the circumstantial evidence which has convicted you, I withhold the death penalty and sentence you to life imprisonment in the state penitentiary.
That's all you need to know. That's all you need to know, and that is in the first part of the film. That's not the big climax or anything. No plot spoilers here. Jaffrey wants his brother Clifford out of the way, and so he could have everything to himself. And so Jaffrey falsely accuses Clifford of killing their father. Now, you already saw at the beginning of this the image of the vampire in Nosferatu. Take a trip with me back to the late 1890s. Bram Stoker writes and publishes a book that he calls Dracula. Dracula has become the quintessential vampire tale. Fast forward to the early 1920s, there is a German film company that wants to do a film adaptation of Dracula. Bram Stoker is gone by this point, so his widow owns the rights. His widow runs the estate, and his widow could not come to a financial agreement with the filmmakers, so no deal. So what do the filmmakers do? They say, okay, what we have to do is we need to change the story to avoid copyright infringement. So they changed the setting and they changed the characters' names, and really that's as far as they went. If you were to sit down and watch Nosferatu and then watch the Bela Lugosi classic film Dracula, it's the same story. You know, a couple of minor differences here and there, but it's the same story. Bram Stoker's widow, she sees Nosferatu and she is livid. She feels they violated copyright. She says, I'm not fooled. They stole my late husband's story. She sued them and she won. And part of the verdict was all existing prints of Nosferatu must be destroyed. Erase the film from existence. And that's what they did, or so they thought. As it turns out, there were already a couple of copies of the film that had been sent overseas here to the US for screening in the US. They escaped. They escaped being destroyed. So thanks to that oversight, we have Nosferatu. Unfortunately for her, but fortunately for us, we have Nosferatu to enjoy. It has been restored. The negative has been cleaned up. It has been given a 4K Blu-ray DVD release. I mean, a few years ago, a friend of mine and I, right around Halloween time, they were doing a screening at the BSO, the Boston Symphony Orchestra. They did a big screening of Nosferatu with a live symphonic orchestra providing a brand new score. So, I mean, Nosferatu is ubiquitous around Halloween time. The name of the vampire in this movie is Count Orlok, rather than Count Dracula. And in Salem, there's actually a horror movie museum called Count Orlok's Nightmare Gallery. So Count Orlok, Nosferatu, definitely is here to stay in terms of influence on pop culture and the horror genre. As far as the Dracula movie is concerned, well, if she didn't want to sell the rights and they made Nosferatu and she won her lawsuit against them, then how was the movie Dracula made? Well, by the time the late 20s rolled around, she did sell the rights to some playwrights who adapted it for the stage for England. Eventually, it left England and made its way over here to the United States. The Hungarian actor, Bela Lugosi, he was offered the leading role. And the thing of it is that because of his Hungarian background, because of his dark complexion, his dark features, he was, as Hollywood did at the time, he was always typecast as the villain. He was typecast as the villain. He also did not speak English fluently. So at first, he didn't want to play the role. It may have been the leading role, but he didn't know if he was right for it. And he had to be talked into it. And eventually he agreed. And on October 5th, 1927, Bela Lugosi makes his Broadway debut and he plays Count Dracula and it becomes a smash hit. So it was a Broadway play, a stage play here in the US in 1927, 4 years before the movie was made. When Universal Studios was putting together the film version, they did not want Lugosi. They wanted a proven box office draw. They wanted the man of 1,000 faces, Lon Chaney, who had made his mark in silent horror films such as Phantom of the Opera and Hunchback of Notre Dame. This was a guy who just would melt into whatever role he was playing. Lon Chaney, sadly, was eager to play the role, but unable to do it because he fell ill and he died of cancer while the film was in production. The second choice for the role was a German actor by the name of Conrad Veidt, who made a big impression in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. He would go on to have a role in Casablanca as well. When that didn't work out, Lugosi, long story short, was choice number 5. He was the one who originated the role on the Broadway stage, but for the film version, he was choice number 5. And he accepted the role because he wanted it that badly. At this point, it fit him like a glove. And interestingly enough, perfect timing, we're in February now, you would think that Dracula would have been released in October. Dracula was actually released on Valentine's Day of 1931, February 14th, 1931. Happy Valentine's Day. And it was marketed as a Gothic romance, the story of the strangest passion the world has ever known. I have here the re-release trailer for Dracula.
I am Dracula. A moment ago, I stumbled upon a most amazing phenomenon. Something so incredible, I mistrust my own judgment. Look.
Dracula. The very mention of the name brings to mind things so evil, so fantastic, so degrading. You wonder if it isn't all a dream, a nightmare.
Rats. Rats. Thousands. Millions of them.
But no, this is no dream. This is Dracula, the original terrifying story of a maniac and a man who lived after death, lived on human blood, took the form of a vampire bat, and lured innocent girls to a fate truly worse than death.
Dracula? Oh, what's he done to you, dearie? Tell me.
He came to me. He opened and extended his arms, and he made me drink.
A Valentine's Day release. So, in 12 days, when it's Valentine's Day, throw in Dracula, and let's all wish it a happy 91st anniversary. Actor Edward Van Sloan. He plays Van Helsing. He, like Bela Lugosi, was in both the Broadway play as well as the film. You would think that they would have been good friends, but he said that Lugosi was always very distant. They didn't really get to know each other all that well, despite all the time they spent together working on this story. Okay, I am going to skip this clip because of time, because we're going to get to the next story. I'd rather be over-prepared than under-prepared. Someone in the chat earlier mentioned that Psycho was one of your favorite horror movies, so I'm happy to say that Psycho does fit neatly into tonight's topic, because Psycho also is based on a book. Psycho was, at first, a novel written by Robert Bloch. The book was published in 1959. It was inspired by a real-life serial killer by the name of Ed Gein. Ed Gein, we don't need to get into the gruesome details, but Ed Gein was like the Jeffrey Dahmer of his day. He was just a sociopath. He was a cannibal. He was a serial murderer. He was just demented. And Robert Bloch read about Ed Gein and conceived of a story that ultimately came to be Psycho. Ed Gein also served as the inspiration for the character Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre films. So Psycho as a book was not a huge hit. It did not make much of a splash. It was not what you could consider a runaway bestseller. Not too many people knew it. At the time that it was first published in 1959, Alfred Hitchcock was enjoying the biggest decade of his life, the 1950s. The 1950s was Hitchcock's golden decade. And by that, what I mean is some of the finest of his classics came from the 50s. We're talking Rear Window, Dial M for Murder. We're talking Vertigo, North by Northwest, some of the best of the best. This was also the decade when Hitchcock got his television series, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, going, and it's also the decade when Hitchcock became an American citizen. So he is sitting on top of the world. He has clout in show business like you would not believe. So after the premiere of North by Northwest in 1959, he found himself in a bit of a creative slump. You know, once you're on top like that, the next question is, how do I top myself? How do I not burn out? And so he experienced a bit of self-doubt. What will my next film be? Should I retire now while I'm on top? Which is what many critics were expecting that he would do. Now, this was 1959, and one thing that was big at the time in terms of horror was drive-in movies, especially if they were 3D, especially if they starred Vincent Price. Movies like House on Haunted Hill, The Tingler, House of Wax, 3D movie theater films. So he went to go see House on Haunted Hill, which came out in 59, starring Vincent Price. And he thought to himself, okay, yeah, it's schlocky, but there's something to it. What if a story like this were told on film and it was in the hands of a capable director? Kind of an insult to the director of House on Haunted Hill, William Castle. But he said, what if a more capable director, such as, I don't know, me, his secretary gave him a copy of the book Psycho and said, I think I found your next movie. He read it, and he was convinced, yup, this is it. Paramount looked at it and said, Hitchcock, absolutely not. They said, what is the matter with you? You are at the top of your game. You're churning out all of these glossy thrillers with A-list celebrities like Cary Grant and Grace Kelly and Jimmy Stewart. I mean, you're working with the best of the best. People are clamoring to be in your movies, and you want to do this schlocky little thriller? You want to do this cheap, exploitative piece of trash, is what they called it. And he was convinced. He was convinced that this was going to be a big moneymaker. Paramount said, well, you know what? We're not going to fund it. They reached a compromise. He agreed to forfeit his director's salary, and he also agreed to fund over half the film. I want to say it was maybe 60%, but I would have to fact check that. But he financed a good portion of the film. He mortgaged his house. He mortgaged his house. And he knew that he had to cut costs. So in order to cut costs, a couple of creative compromises had to be made. For example, he did not hire A-list celebrities. You would not see Grace Kelly, Shirley MacLaine, Montgomery Clift. You would not see any of the actors he had worked together before with in this one. Salaries were too high. So he went for lesser known people. Janet Leigh at the time was probably most known for being a pinup girl and for being married to Tony Curtis. She was an actress. She had done Touch of Evil with Orson Welles, but she wasn't, in her own right, she wasn't, a box office draw. Anthony Perkins was an Academy Award nominee for Friendly Persuasion, and he was more a matinee idol than an actor who was taken seriously. Hitch found them both to be perfect. So they were both cast, she as Marion Crane and he as Norman Bates. Now, as far as the differences between the book and the movie are concerned, in the book, her name is Mary, not Marion. I could not tell you why the change. Doesn't make a bit of a difference, but in the book, her name is Mary. In the book, she is killed off in the very first chapter. The book is all from Norman Bates's perspective. It was Hitchcock who added the whole backstory of how she desperately wanted to get to her boyfriend, how she had this stolen $40,000 from her boss. Now, in the book, she had stolen $40,000, but we don't get nearly the detail of her personal life as we do in the film. As far as and again, I'm going to avoid spoilers here. As far as the shower scene, which we all know about, the shower scene in the book is much more gruesome, much more graphic. In the book, she is beheaded. Her head gets cut off. You certainly do not have that in the film. The film enjoyed unprecedented success. It's mentioned in Billy Joel's "We Didn't Start the Fire," for crying out loud. So that's when you know you've made it. The musical score, the shrieking violins, has been parodied and imitated everywhere. This movie has become this movie is firmly entrenched in the pantheon of film history, not just American film history, but film history. The shower sequence is probably one of the most analyzed sequences of film ever to be studied by film students in film schools for the editing, the sound, the music. So Psycho was not just a hit, it was a phenomenon. It was a phenomenon. And not surprisingly, there were sequels, but they didn't happen until after Hitchcock died in 1980. The first sequel, Psycho 2, would not come out until 1983, 23 years later. Then 3 years later, in 1986, Psycho 3 came out. And then in 1990, a prequel called Psycho 4: The Beginning. Anthony Perkins is in all four as Norman Bates. There was, of course, in the past decade, a prequel series called Bates Motel with Vera Farmiga and Freddie Highmore as Norman Bates. Great series. I think that began probably around 2010 or 11, Bates Motel. As far as the shower sequence is concerned, a few tidbits I can offer you about this. Number one, there is no nudity. Now, why do I say that? Why am I beginning with that piece of information? Because the censors were convinced that there was. This was before film ratings. So in 1960, you would submit your films to the censorship board, and they would either approve it or reject it. And they took a look at Psycho. And one thing that they said was, we see nudity in the shower sequence. Half of them said they saw nudity. The other half of them said, no, we didn't see nudity. Hitchcock said, okay. They said, fix it. He said, fine. He took the film back. He did not change one frame. He did nothing. He just simply resubmitted it after a while. They took a look at it and they said, okay, good, better. It just goes to show you the skill with the skillful editing. It's all the power of suggestion. There is no nudity. She is Janet Leigh. She's not nude. She's wearing moleskin. Now, again, because of time, I'm going to, well, maybe we do have enough time for this one. I think we do have enough time for this one. This is the original trailer for Psycho. Before I play the trailer for you, just one more thing about the shower sequence. In the shower sequence, two things. You have, in place of the traditional stage blood, they used Bosco chocolate syrup, which Hitchcock felt looked better on screen in black and white film. He felt the consistency looked more like blood than traditional stage blood. As far as the sound effect of the stabbing knife, what he did was Hitchcock sat at the end of a long banquet table. And he closed his eyes to visualize. He folded his arms across his massive chest, leaned back in his seat, and he said, go. The sound guy had all different kinds of melons lined up down the table. Watermelon, honeydew, cassava, every possible kind of melon you can think of. So the sound guy proceeded to work his way down the table, giving each melon a single stab. And once Hitchcock heard the sound that he liked, he said, stop. Turned out it was the cassava melon. So he now has all this lovely chopped fruit salad all over his table. He's got the chocolate syrup. I mean, this is a foodie's delight, this whole shower sequence. But I do want to show you the trailer because this is living proof of just how good of a showman Hitchcock actually was. This is a trailer unlike any you have ever seen before.
Good afternoon. Here we have a quiet little motel, tucked away off the main highway, and as you see, perfectly harmless looking, when in fact, it has now become known as the scene of the crime. This motel also has, as an adjunct, an old house, which is, if I may say so, a little more sinister looking, less innocent than the motel itself. And in this house, the most dire, horrible events took place. I think we can go inside because the place is up for sale, although I don't know who's going to buy it now. In that window on the second floor, the single one in front, that's where the woman was first seen. Let's go inside. You see, even in daylight, this place still looks a bit sinister. Now, it was at the top of these stairs that the second murder took place. She came out of the door there and met the victim at the top. Of course, in a flash, there was the knife, and in no time, the victim tumbled and fell with a horrible crash. I think the back broke immediately. It hit the floor. It's difficult to describe the way that the twisting of the well, I won't dwell upon it. Come upstairs. Of course, the victim, or should I say victims, hadn't any conception as to the type of people they would be confronted with in this house, especially the woman. She was the weirdest and the most... Well, let's go into her bedroom. Here's the woman's room, still beautifully preserved. And the imprint of her figure on the bed where she used to lay. I think some of her clothes are still in this wardrobe. This was the son's room, but we won't go in there because his favorite spot was the little parlor behind his office in the motel. Let's go down there. This young man, you had to feel sorry for him. After all, being dominated by an almost maniacal woman was enough to drive anyone to the extreme of, well, let's go in. Well, I suppose you'd call this his hideaway. His hobby, as you see, was taxidermy. Crow here, an owl there. Now, an important scene took place in this room. There was a private supper here. And, oh, by the way, this picture has great significance because, let's go along to cabin number 1. I want to show you something there. All tidied up. The bathroom. Well, they've cleaned all this up now. Big difference. You should have seen the blood. The whole place was, well, it's too horrible to describe. Dreadful. And I'll tell you, there's a very important clue was found here. Down there. Well, the murderer, you see, crept in here. Very slowly, of course, the shower was on, there was no sound. And,
Audiences had never seen a trailer like that before, and I would be so bold as to suggest we probably will never see a trailer like that again, which is both good and bad. I mean, it's bad because of how creative it is and how great it is, but it's also good because I think if anybody were to try to imitate it, it would lose its specialness, if you know what I mean. Okay, well, I do see the time. It is 8:06 according to my clock, so I'm going to be cherry picking here with the clips, but I can tell you that one book that probably does deserve a mention is one that is also proven to be one of the most controversial and one of the most contested books in the horror genre, proclaiming to be based on a true story ever written. I speak, of course, of the Amityville Horror. Now, the Amityville Horror, there's so much that could be said about this whole story. It's really two horror stories in one. One of them, Indisputable Facts, which is a horrific true crime story. And the second is the more controversial, okay, let's take this with a grain of salt kind of thing. Facts, indisputable fact. There is this home which still stands today, and it's a colonial home in Long Island in Amityville, New York, and it was built in the 1920s. It went through several owners. Long story short, in November of 1974, a family by the name of DeFeo had been living there for almost 10 years. It was a married couple and their 5 children, 3 boys, 2 girls. The oldest was a boy. The oldest was their son, Ronald. And on the evening of, well, it's the middle of the night, actually, November 13th, 1974, he went through the home and he systematically shot and killed each member of his family while they slept in their beds. I mean, this is the stuff that true crime podcasts are made for. It's horrific. The 4 siblings of his that he killed ranged in age from 9 to 18. At the time, he was 22, 23 years old. He killed both of his parents. Now, as far as the details of the crime, we don't need to get into that. But I will say that he was put on trial and he was found guilty, and he was given consecutive 6 consecutive 25-year sentences, 1 for each murder. And so he spent the rest of his life in prison. He died only about a year ago. About a year ago is when he died. So the house remained empty for about a year after the murders. The murders occurred in November of 74. And then in December of 75, 13 months later, a family by the name of Lux bought the house. They moved in, and 28 days later, they moved out claiming paranormal disturbances. And a book called The Amityville Horror was written by an author named Jay Anson. Jay Anson never even met them. They never met, but he based his story on everything all the materials that he was provided with. Now, in recent years, the book has been very heavily debunked. Even the paranormal, the married couple, Ed and Lorraine Warren, who are featured in the Conjuring franchise, they were a real-life paranormal investigative team. She was a psychic. He was a self-proclaimed demonologist, and they would investigate alleged haunted houses and that kind of thing. They investigated the Amityville house. She famously said when she investigated the house, she felt a presence, and she said, "I hope this is as close to hell as I'll ever get." Now, when the book was published in 1977, people ate it up. It came out at just the right time, hot off the heels of movies like The Exorcist and The Omen, both based on novels. And so, it was just, it was the kind of story that just spoke to the 70s. So it was inevitable that there would be a film version, which came out in 1979. Lorraine Warren has gone on record as saying she in no way endorses the book, and even less so the movie. But the movie it's an interesting watch. It's not a great movie. In fact, it's rather hokey. However, it was a huge, huge hit. Now, there was a television journalist for ABC in New York by the name of Marvin Scott, an Emmy-winning TV journalist. He begrudgingly was assigned this story. So he went and he had to spend a night in this house with Ed and Lorraine Warren and a camera crew so that Ed and Lorraine Warren could conduct a seance. And the thing of it is that he went on record as saying that he did not believe any of it. He thought that the Warrens were, phonies, and he felt that the story was all one big elaborate hoax, just a money-making scheme. And he said that he found it more frightening. He found the movie completely ridiculous. He said that he was more frightened by the pot-smoking crowd surrounding him in the theater than he was by the movie itself. So take it for what you will, but I can tell you that there has been a series of owners in the years since, none of whom have publicly claimed any paranormal disturbances. The house recently went back on the market, in fact, about a month or two ago, and the owner is insisting, no, I am not selling it because of any paranormal disturbances. However, there apparently have been several realtors who have claimed that things happened to them when they were showing the house every time it passed hands over the past 10 or 15 years. So make of it what you will, but the Amityville Horror, definitely the... Now, I'm going to skip the trailer because I'm going to call your attention to the photograph on the right. The night of the seance, needless to say, there were no children in the house. The night of the they had cameras set up all over the house, cameras that would, I guess, what we would call today, if we were to use our iPhones, a photo burst. Similar to that, they would take multiple pictures each second, and one picture and one picture only, in a fraction of a second, captured this image. And this image appears to be the image of a little boy. No one who was there that night, none of the camera crew, the Warrens, Marvin Scott, the news intern, Laura DiDio, none of them knew where this image came from. And so some have said, well, that's proof that there must have been at least something there. Is it perhaps one of the murdered DeFeo children, one of the youngest sons? Others say maybe it's just one of the camera crew on his hands and knees, and maybe his eyes are not glowing. Maybe he's just wearing eyeglasses that are sort of reflecting, kind of like what mine are doing right now. So who knows? Who knows? Again, you decide. You know, of course, people have said maybe the photograph is faked. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you. Anybody who was there that night, they all have the same answer, and that answer is, I don't know. And that brings us to The Shining. Speaking of haunted house movie, well, haunted hotel in this case, Stephen King and his wife Tabitha, they spent a few nights in Colorado, away from home for a while, in September of 1974. They stayed in room 217. They had dinner in the hotel restaurant one evening, and it was off season. So they were the only one, like practically the only ones there. They were certainly the only ones in the dining room having dinner that night. They had a couple of violin players, and he just found it surreal and a little, you know, unnerving. And he said, there's a story here. And that night, apparently he had a dream, or I should say a nightmare. And in that nightmare, he dreamt that his little boy was being chased down the hall of the hotel by a fire hose that came to life. He woke up and he said, now I really have my story. So the book was published in 1977. And if you've ever read the book, then you may recall that there is in fact a scene where little Danny Torrance is being chased by a fire hose down the hall. Now, when the film version was made in 1980, directed by Stanley Kubrick, lots of changes were made. First of all, the character of Jack. Stephen King felt that Jack Nicholson was all wrong. He felt that he was too campy. He felt that he was way too over the top. He always pictured, he said, the character of Jack Torrance in the story to be a tall, thin, serious man struggling sincerely with his alcoholism and with his inner demons, not flamboyant like the way Jack Nicholson did it, playing it up for laughs. The two little ghost girls, iconic ghost girls from the film, they are nowhere to be found in the book. In the movie, there is a hedge maze. In the book, it's topiary that comes to life. And room 217 in the book, in the movie, became room 237. Why? Because the hotel, the real life hotel in Oregon, the Timberline Lodge in Oregon, right here, they had a room 217. And they said, change the number, please, because we don't want to lose business. Nobody will want to stay in room 217. So that's the reason why the number in the movie is changed to 237. The thing of it is that, of course, everyone who stays at that hotel, at this lodge ever since, they all want to stay in room 217. So they may as well have just kept it at 217. So if this place looks familiar to you, you see this in the opening credits of The Shining. This is the Timberline Lodge in Oregon that stands in for the Overlook Hotel. And I do have here, it's a minute and a half. I do have here the trailer for The Shining, just to let you
I
know.
suppose they told you anything in Denver about the tragedy we had up here during the winter of 1970? I hired a man named Charles Grady as the winter caretaker. From what I've been told, I mean, he seemed like a completely normal individual. But at some point during the winter, he must have suffered some kind of a complete mental breakdown. He ran amok and killed his family with an axe.
Well, you can rest assured, Mr. Ullman, that's not gonna happen with me.
That's right.
Mom, do you really want to go and live in that hotel for the winter?
Sure I do. It'll be lots of fun.
The only thing that can get a bit trying up here during the winter is the tremendous sense of isolation.
Is there something bad here?
I fear you will have to deal with this matter in the harshest possible way.
I agreed that I killed you with Manny.
You did this to him, didn't you?
I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains. Here's Johnny.
The Shining opened up around the same time as the original Friday the 13th. And unfortunately, Friday the 13th crushed it at the box office. So The Shining didn't do as well financially in its initial release as they had hoped. They see, Camp Crystal Lake instead. Now, I do have here, and again, I'm checking the time. I do have here Stephen King explaining himself why he was not a big fan of the film version of The Shining. We'll just let him say the words.
I have a real problem with The Shining, and Stanley Kubrick knew that I had a problem with The Shining. I had a discussion with him beforehand. He said, "Stephen, Stanley Kubrick here. Don't you agree that all stories of ghosts are fundamentally optimistic?" I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, if there are ghosts, it means we survive death, and that's fundamentally an optimistic view, isn't it?" And I said, "Well, Mr. Kubrick, what about hell?" And there was a long pause on the telephone line, and then he said in a very stiff and very different voice, "I don't believe in hell." And I thought to myself, well, that's fine, but some of us do, and some of us believe that ghosts may survive, and that may be hell. And that was sort of where I was coming from with The Shining. But in the novel, The Shining, Jack Torrance is a difficult character, but he's fundamentally a sympathetic character. And I always visualized him as a piece of metal that's bent first one way and the other by these malignant spirits who basically want his son because his son is a psychically powerful person. So I saw these all as warm characters, characters that were being threatened by forces from without, from ghosts, from real supernatural creatures. And the film is extremely cold. Stanley Kubrick saw The Haunting as coming from Jack Torrance, from the Jack Nicholson character, whereas I always saw it from outside. So we had a fundamental difference of opinion about it. I always thought that the real difference between my take on it and Stanley Kubrick's take on it was this. In my novel, the hotel burns. In Kubrick's movie, the hotel freezes. It's a difference between warmth and cold. But the images are striking. There's no doubt about it. I mean, Jack Nicholson's face in the doorway, his bearded, crazy, grinning face, and he says, "Here's Johnny," which was his ad lib, and it became, part of the movie. So the images are striking, but to me, that's surface. It's not substance. So I used to describe The Shining, the film, as something like a beautiful car that had no engine in it.
So I think it's best when we hear it straight from the source themselves. And to wrap this up, Misery, I just want to give a shout out to Misery. Misery was inspired, they always seem to be inspired by dreams, don't they? But he was inspired by a nightmare he had once when he was flying on a plane. He was flying a red-eye, he was sleeping, And as he was sleeping, he had a dream. And in his dream, he was on the plane. And the woman next to him kept bothering him, saying, "I'm your #1 fan." He woke up. The woman was in real life just sleeping, minding her own business. And that inspired the character of Annie Wilkes. Now, Stephen King loved what director Rob Reiner, had done with Stand By Me. So he said, "I want you to do Misery." And Rob Reiner agreed. And Annie Wilkes is voted on the American Film Institute's 100 Greatest Villains list. She's voted number 17. I mentioned already how she got the Academy Award. King has said that the character of Annie Wilkes is a metaphor for his struggles with addiction. And I already mentioned how Dolores Claiborne was written with her in mind. And did you know that Misery was adapted for the Broadway stage in 2015 with Bruce Willis in the James Caan role and Laurie Metcalf in the Kathy Bates role, if you can believe it. So we're going to skip the trailer. And I want to allow enough time for questions and for thoughts, but I leave you with this thought right here. Why invent all this artificial horror when we already have enough horror in the world? People who don't like horror movies, my wife included. You know, my wife has said to me a lot of times, every time I say, "Oh, I love Halloween, I love horror movies," she always says the same thing, which I can understand. What she says is, there's already so much unpleasantness in the world. Why do I need to pay money to go see it on screen? Well, Donald Pleasance, who plays Dr. Loomis in Halloween, Donald Pleasance did a documentary on horror movies once called Terror in the Aisles. Great documentary. It's dated. It's from 1984. But he quoted Stephen King. He quoted Stephen King, who said, "Perhaps we invent these artificial horrors to help us cope with the real ones." Food for thought. Food for thought. So with that, I would like to once again offer my contact information, my podcast, Facebook group, same name, Silver Screeners, Twitter and Instagram. And I will stop sharing my screen in a moment, and we can go into the chat and into the Q&A to see what thoughts you have, questions, comments of your own. Love to hear them.
Well, Frank, I love Patricia's comment. She says, "This is my 3rd Mendoza presentation, and they just keep getting better." So thanks, Patricia.
Thank you.
Karen asks, what book adaptation is your favorite for this genre and why?
Oh, okay. Okay, so the question is my favorite book or my favorite film of a book, because I would have 2 different answers for that. I would say that among my favorite books, Frankenstein, The Exorcist, Misery, and The Shining. I know that's 4 answers. I know that's probably a cop-out, but I couldn't narrow it down any further. Those are probably my favorite books of this genre. As far as favorite films, film adaptations of books or plays, well, I already mentioned Wait Until Dark with Audrey Hepburn, which is, it's a play, not a book, but that is without a doubt, hands down, one of the best thrillers that I have ever seen in my life. That was based on previously published material. I do think that there is a lot of, I will use the word disturbing. I would say that there is a lot of disturbing dramatic power in The Omen. It's not a movie that I would watch lightly or freely. It's not like I always say this, there are always 2 types of movies that you can fold laundry to and movies that you can't. And I would say of The Omen, buckle up, because this is going to bother you. This is going to disturb you. I find The Omen more disturbing than The Exorcist, to be honest with you. Now, I'm not saying that I think that they're low quality. I think that they have a lot of substance. I think that they have a lot of forethought in the writing, a lot of brilliance. But it's extremely, it's a lot of it is just very, bothersome, which if you think about it, that's what stories like this set out to do. You think about what is it in human nature for some people that makes us, that draws us to these kinds of stories? Why do we get disappointed when we finish watching a horror movie that we found not scary? Why are we disappointed that we did not get scared? Why do we crave that feeling of, whether it's a jump scare or whether it's the building suspense, why are we disappointed when a movie fails to deliver that, or a book fails to deliver that? You know, what is it that is it seeking that adrenaline rush? Is it something cathartic with our own inner demons, or our own painful experiences, our own traumas? No easy answers, of course. I mean, I'm throwing out some deep philosophical questions here, but my point is that if I had to point to stories that I found the most effectively written, not necessarily something that make me comfortable, I would say that The Omen and The Exorcist books are definitely up there as well.
And Karen says, I went to see Stephen King discuss his book, Sleeping Beauties, and someone asked which of his characters he'd like to have dinner with, and his answer was Annie Wilkes. So how about that?
Oh, wow.
So Frank, it's just about 8:30. Why don't we wrap it there? Do you have any last words for the group before we end for the night?
Just a couple of things. First, thank you all again. I really, truly hope you enjoyed this. Happy Valentine's Day. Watch Dracula on Valentine's Day. And in the words of, I say this in all of my podcast episodes at the beginning, I always quote Lauren Bacall, who once said, it's not an old movie if you haven't seen it. So don't get turned off by black and white. Don't get turned off by however many decades old a movie that you've never seen before may be. If it's a movie you haven't seen, it's not old for you. And I always say, keep on screaming.
There you go. Well, thank you so much, Frank. Really appreciate it. I'm sure we'll see you in the future, hopefully in person. But let's give Frank a big virtual round of applause. And I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I'll look for an email from me tomorrow with a link to a feedback survey and a link to this recording. So thank you all again, and have a great night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you very much.